I've got a good question for you. Do you think God has a sense of humor? Stay tuned. Hi, my name is Father Mike Manning. I'm a Catholic priest. God bless you. Thank you very much for coming and being with us. I'm very much concerned about making sure that God is not just someone far away from you, that God is someone who is really present in your life. And sometimes your life can be overwhelmed with the things that are happening on television or politics, and it's very far from what the experience is of having God in church. I'm going to be speaking with a delightful guest today who has the talent of bringing Christ in a very, very powerful way, aside from just what happens in church, into the world that we experience in the media or even comedy clubs. John, thank you so very much for coming all the way from New York and being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
We've known each other, well, briefly. I got to know you about a year ago, and I hooked you, asking you, would you think of coming? And Sister Pat has been on your tail trying to get you to come and be with us. Thank
yes,
you.
I met you in that hotbed of sin, Beverly Hills.
Beverly Hills, whoa.
At an awards show full of celebrities, and you and I were in the corner talking, and
yes.
so it's really a pleasure to come back and join you on your show.
Thank you very
and meet
much.
your lovely staff.
Yeah, John, you've moved into a world that, for me, is, I think for all of us, is very exciting. It's the world of lights, it's the world of television, it's the world of popularity, of beautiful people and everything seeming to go well. But sometimes that can be a world that is very far from God. And yet you're coming at us with an experience of Christ in your own life. Would you tell us a little bit about that and how that perhaps can maybe even permeate the world that seems oftentimes far away from that?
Well, sure. I have an abnormally Catholic background, an extremely Catholic background.
I love it. I love it.
We used to have open casket reunions. My mother is an ex-nun.
Okay.
She was with the Daughters of Wisdom, and she spent many years in Africa as a registered nurse.
Oh, wow.
She grew up in the Deep South, and they put her through nursing school when she joined the convent. And my father is an ex-Franciscan brother. He taught history to Catholic boys in Brooklyn. He wore the brown robes and the rope belt and walked amongst the people like the lost Jedi of Flatbush. And my father, so growing up it was kind of confusing because I would say, you know, well, my father was a brother, my mother was a sister, and I'm the whitest guy out there. Your father wasn't a brother, your mother's not a sister, you're this white. But
well, all this incest is too much.
Well, my father, when he was a brother, he went to St. Francis Prep in Brooklyn and later taught at St. Anthony's. And he was a patient at Holy Family Hospital in Brooklyn when my mother, the nun from the South, was transferred there after she finished nursing school. Now, my father had made a pledge to God that he would never fall in love with someone. But from all accounts I've heard, he fell instantly, hopelessly, desperately, passionately over the edge of not coming back in love day one with this quiet Southern nun that he knew he could never have and had promised God he would never want. So they became pen pals, and the church sent her off to Africa to work first with lepers and then a hospital in the jungles of Malawi. Wow. And my father stayed behind in Brooklyn and carried a torch silently for 10 years. He would send her letters, detailed letters about what was happening in America back in the 60s with Dr. King and the civil rights movement in Vietnam. My mother's village she was living in Malawi had no newspapers or radio, so her letters became the de facto newspaper for the village. The Mother Superior would open them, read them out loud, and my mom was the last to get her mail.
Get out of here. My
mom was the last to get her mail. I know it's shocking. There's nuns in the room. I know you're shocked that this could happen with the order. But you know, she had no idea. My mother had no idea that he was in love. And my dad eventually at one point told his superior in the brothers that he was thinking about leaving. He wasn't sure what the right choice was. And his superior just said to him, not knowing anything, just said, if you love her, marry her. So she was transferred back to the States. My dad borrowed a car drove 9 hours down to Virginia, found the hospital where she was working an overnight shift, talked till the sun came up, and then he told her he loved her, and she threw him out of the hospital. Saying,
I love it.
Saying, you have no right. I mean, we've got nuns here. Imagine if a man told you he loved you when you're in full habit. It's an outrage. And she said, you have no right. I'm wearing this habit. Can't you see? But he had gotten through. And so she was back in Africa, and eventually she knew that her Mother Superior would never let her request a transfer. So she wrote a letter to Rome in secret. Her father had just died, and she said she wanted to go back to the South to be near her mother. She secretly handed the letter to a priest, a cool priest who traveled by motorcycle from village to village in the African jungle. He secretly mailed it to Rome. They sent her back. So my father came down
back to Africa.
Back to the South, back to Virginia. So my dad came down again, and he's wearing his clerical collar. He came down to visit, and he met her whole family as her friend. But when he was saying goodbye, he kissed my mother's mother on the cheek, kissed my mother's sister, and shook my mother's hand. And all the Southern ladies knew he was in love when he did that. So eventually he talked her into it, and she agreed to leave, and they were married 60 days later on a Southern Army base.
Wow.
It was a first love and a second marriage for them both. So growing up having two ex-clergy as parents, I could never afford the therapy I needed, which is why I turned to comedy and trying to please strangers in dark rooms filled with alcohol and cigarette smoke.
Tell us a little bit about your relationship with Christ, though. And that certainly is something that is going to be dominant, I'm sure.
Well, absolutely.
But how did that happen?
Well, you said something interesting in your introduction about how these places can be very far from God, and I would respectfully disagree. God's there already.
Yes.
I mean, it's like saying being away from reality. Reality's there. We can be in denial of stuff. Mm-hmm. And this is what I say to my atheist friends all the time as well. You know, you don't have to believe. But I believe that, you know, God is a presence that's always there. And what the Catholics call the presence of the Holy Spirit, which is something that I've felt on stage many times in my life. You know, in many ways, I've always viewed religion as being exactly like science, in that it's man's way of trying to understand the mysteries of creation.
Amen. Of course. How do you deal with death? How do you deal with tragedy?
Exactly, right?
Yes, precisely.
Yeah, and so from there, you know, it's always walking the line, especially in the secular world, with faith, of how do you separate faith from superstition, or what is the lines between religion and faith. When I was a little kid, I was a very good Catholic kid. I did all my sacraments, went to Mass every week and every holy day, grace before every meal, prayers at night. And I tried as hard as I could to be a good Catholic, because that's what you got to do, but I never really understood what it meant. When I was 8 years old, they premiered this show, Battlestar Galactica. And I think a whole generation of young men my age loved Star Wars, because the Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker story was kind of like the biblical God and Jesus story. Sure. The father is really powerful, but boy, the son's a lot more likable in some parts. And so Battlestar Galactica was the first like Star Wars ripoff for TV, and I begged my dad, please let me stay up late to watch it. My dad was a principal by now, and very Brooklyn. He's like, you can ask all you want, you're not staying up till 11 o'clock on a school night. And I thought, I'm such a good little kid. I go to church, and I do all the stuff you ask me to do, and I say my prayers, and you won't even let me stay up. So I'm lying in bed, awake, 8 years old, to spite him. And my mother was working at a hospital.
Your show.
Right, yeah, it's like, I jump through all these ecclesiastical hoops for you, and you don't even let me stay up.
Yeah.
My dad shows up at 11:15 in my bedroom and says, I want you to see something. And he drags me down the hall, and I see the TVs on in his bedroom. And I thought, oh, my dad's going to let me watch the end of Battlestar Galactica. He's cool after all. But it wasn't my science fiction show. My dad had on the late news, where they were re-airing Jimmy Carter signing the Camp David peace accord between Israel and Egypt. Now, he couldn't believe, and this is as a Franciscan, he couldn't believe an American Christian president, whatever you think of Jimmy Carter, that he had found a way to make peace in one corner of the Middle East. And my dad wanted me to see a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jew embracing.
Wow.
Now, I was too young to appreciate any of this. I just thought Moshe Dayan was cool because he had an eye patch. But as I turned and I looked at my father, and I saw this look of joy on his face, the beaming out of his face and his smile, it was the first time I understood what America and what Christianity could and should be.
A bridge, a bridge.
Blessed are the peacemakers.
Amen, yeah.
So that was the beginning of my, you know, I was very religious, but that was the beginning of my spiritual awareness. and what the path could be.
Tell us a little, you disagreed with me with regard to the idea of God doesn't seem to be present, as I said that. But unless somebody like you has the guts to be able to say something and do something, the wave of activity that can move away from God can be overpowering. And that's kind of what I'm really
I think you're right.
Not to justify what I'm saying, but I just want to say thank you for what you're doing. You're getting ready to go and be on with Bill Maher, huh?
I'll be doing a Bill Maher show. I was a regular on Bill Maher's show when it was on ABC.
Yeah.
And they would have me on a lot to debate different religious figures because of my background. I was on with Jerry Falwell. I was also on with Bishop John Shelby Spong, who I admire very much, from the Diocese of Newark. I was also on with David Duke, the notorious ex-Klansman,
and you just threw in that you've just come back from doing a program for atheists.
Yes, last night I was in Hollywood.
Atheists ask you to come in, knowing that you're a Christian, believing in Christ. How in heaven's name do you work that?
It's so funny. I was asked to do stand-up for the Atheist Society of New York City earlier this year, and I'm like, I'm a believer, right? They said, yeah, it's fine. So I said, well, I'll be Gentile with you. It's like, what did Jesus say? In my Father's house there are many mansions, right? I got him on the Gentile side. In my Father's house...
You got to listen. You got to make sure you get it.
In my Father's house there are many mansions. So one of, my mom, the ex-nun, calls what artists do a ministry, and I've tried to stay true to that because I've done a lot of things, like I hosted America's Funniest Home Videos for 2 years, and I learned I could make a living reading a teleprompter and smiling and having a fake tan, but it wasn't really organic to me, and I much preferred going into the comedy clubs and talking about faith, but not in a nice little somnambulistic, sleepy time way. A lot of what we get about Jesus in our society is Franco Zeffirelli, Jesus of Nazareth, where he's depicted as being this British blue-eyed Xanax addict who walks around it's a beautiful film, but the actual Jesus was a really gutsy character.
Listen, we got to take a break. I want to come back to that. I want you to expatiate a little bit more on this gutsy character, but I also want to hear that you were the one who had the last television interview with George Harris of the Beatles.
And we talked all about God for 4 hours.
Listen, we're gonna come back, and I want to hear how that happened. Stay tuned. Could you tell us a little bit? I know that I'm going to resonate with what you're going to say, but Jesus was not just the nice person, the sleeping Jesus that kind of walks around with a gooey look on his face. Jesus was a gutsy person.
A gutsy guy. I mean,
how do you react to that?
I think it's exactly who he was. I mean, he was a peaceful, radical, nonviolent revolutionary. Hung around with lepers and hookers and crooks. Never spoke English. Wasn't an American citizen. He was certainly anti-greed, some would say anti-capitalism.
Yes.
He was...
walking up to somebody and saying, why don't you give up all your wealth and come follow me?
That's an inconvenient Messiah. He was anti-death penalty completely.
Yes.
A lot of people don't like to hear that, but I'll give the Catholic Church credit for leading that fight. He was, in many ways, anti-public prayer, Matthew 6:5.
Yeah.
But yet he was never anti-gay. He didn't persecute those folks.
Well, he didn't persecute anybody that was hurting.
He didn't persecute anyone, exactly.
Anybody that was hurting.
He drove the money changers out of the temple because they were charging too much interest on the poor. He was a hardcore activist for the less fortunate.
And also against hypocrites.
Totally against hypocrites.
And the problem is that his greatest battle was with religious leaders.
Exactly. Although one of his best, the Pharisees, who were always trying to trip him up, those stories about how the religious bosses of his era were always trying to trip him up and make him look bad.
Correct.
And it's brilliant how he handled them on everything from taxes to following the Sabbath rules.
Now, whose image is on that coin, and how do you deal with that?
That's Jesus saying, pay your taxes. There's bigger things to worry about than money in this life.
Yes.
And he, overturned rules all over the place. In the Sermon on the Mount, he overturns eye for an eye. I mean, that couldn't have been too popular back then. He really, he's not the kind of guy to keep you in your comfort zone. And even to this day, when you read the Gospels, it's shocking how Jesus really wants to push you out of your safe, secure place and force you to confront the fact that love is the only thing that's going to save us. And that's it. and that's the only policy that works consistently, and that you will only feel what I call the presence of the Holy Spirit when you love actively and selflessly. And that's a tough sell, especially if you're talking about it and trying to be funny in a comedy club. And by the way, I also want to add, he never once demanded tax cuts for the wealthiest Nazarenes.
It's true, yeah.
I'm glad you guys get that joke. You guys are awesome.
It's true, it's true.
And, you know, as far as health care, he never asked a leper for a copay. I mean, Jesus had single prayer health care.
But he talks about love, but he goes to a radical extent of
radical love.
Because he says, I even want you to love your enemy.
And look, the night they came to arrest him, when those jackbooted thugs of the Roman occupying army came to bust him at Gethsemane, his followers were bearing arms. They wanted to fight.
Peter throws out the sword. He wants to cut off the guy's ear.
And Jesus says, he who lives by the sword will die by the sword. Now, some Christians use that to justify the death penalty, but Christ was doing the exact opposite. Yeah. He was saying, no, violence isn't going to work. It was the most powerful anti-violence statement he ever made. Yes. He didn't resist. He turned the other cheek. He submitted. He knew he had his marching orders from the commander-in-chief. But it was another example. I mean, time and time again, when the Roman centurion says, please come to my house and heal my slave, and the apostles were outraged about this, and we can speculate what that relationship was with the Roman centurion's slave, but they were saying, this guy's an occupying military officer in our land. And Jesus is like, hey guys, that's what I do. He asked for my help. He believes I'm going to help the guy, even if he is your enemy.
And that was the other thing. This other little statement that he threw in, not only love your enemy, but here's the zinger. Do good to those who persecute you. Whoa. Mm-hmm. Whoa, that's dying.
Yeah, right?
That you die to yourself to that extent of willing to do that. And another little interesting thing is a disciple by the name of Simon, not Simon Peter, but Simon the Zealot. Mm-hmm. The Zealots were, excuse the phrase, terrorists.
Absolutely.
They were out to try to get rid of the occupying army. And Jesus, whether this man was formally a terrorist or was actually living with that now when he was called, Jesus called a terrorist to be part of his group, and he allowed that experience of love to bring about a reconciliation and perhaps a softening of the force of what that man was with.
I mean, look at St. Paul. I mean, many people have said that he was one of the zealots,
well, he was out to put them all in jail and possibly even killing.
Exactly.
We're not sure about to that extent, but strong in his desire.
When you put this stuff in historical context, I mean, you know, the Samaritans were hated in those days. When he made the Samaritan the hero of a story, that was a revolutionary act.
And not only were they hated, but they were heretics.
Exactly. And
they had the wrong interpretation of the Bible to the Jews, and And how do we treat heretics? I mean, we burn them at the stake.
Well, that would be like me going in and making, you know, an Afghani warlord the hero in a story for modern day times.
And all of a sudden,
oh, but they're evil. I've been taught they're evil. And Jesus is like, forget what you've been taught. I'm telling you how it is. When you look at how he overturned the laws of the death penalty, when you look at how he overturned the laws of how women are treated, I mean, he was really the first feminist of the Bible. You know, it used to be that you could divorce your wife if you no longer delighted in her.
Precisely.
And Jesus said, no way, man. If you throw your wife out like that, you've made an adulterer out of her and out of yourself.
Correct.
And that's the same passage where he talks about, you know, committing adultery in your heart, which I think, going back to President Carter, he misinterpreted. You know, when he said, if you look on a woman lustfully, you've committed adultery in your heart, what's he saying to these men? Think about how crude men are on the sidewalk now, ladies. Imagine how it was 2,000 years ago in the Holy Land when some maiden goes down to buy some spelt at the market. Jesus is saying, if you're ogling women, if you're sexually harassing them, lustful looks, you're committing adultery. Yeah. He's telling them, treat women with respect.
Wow.
Which is still a radical idea.
And then to ask this maybe 12-year-old young girl, 13-year-old girl, would you make a decision as to whether or not the Messiah will come into the world? Asking Mary if she would do that. Mm-hmm. The whole world waited for her to make that decision. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting for me because it's hard talking about this stuff. You know, Billy Wilder said, if you're going to tell people the truth, make it funny or they'll kill you. And
wow, that's neat, isn't it? That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
And as a comedian, I was always drawn to political matters. My father was a history teacher, and I was a regular on Bill Maher's show. And as I get more into faith, it makes people very uncomfortable. So I'm happy whenever I can go play somewhere, be it atheist rooms or Christian rooms, where I can talk about religion in a more less delicate manner, I guess. I'm always very pro-Christ, I'm very pro-God, and I'm very into making fun of hypocrisy, because we all do it. It's one of the sins that we're all heir to.
Correct.
So it lends itself to a lot of very interesting comedy, but on another level, and I do a lot of radio, a lot of political radio, and a lot of progressive radio. And I can tell you, a lot of liberals out there are people who have a lot of faith. And they grew up in religion, and maybe they still are religious, maybe they're not, but they still have the faith. But it often seems in the media, the only kinds of depictions of faith we get are atheists and Westboro Baptist Church screaming hateful things outside funerals.
These are the ones that
That's what we're fed in the
we
media.
even get angry at the burial of a soldier.
We're fed right-wing, fundamentalist, hateful Christianity that we see in the media, and we're fed atheism. And we don't see the people of faith who are out there doing great things in the community. And I say all the time, the overwhelming majority of Christians, Jews, and Muslims around the world are getting along just fine right now. It's the far right-wing fundamentalist fringes
on both sides
that are creating all the hate out there. And every culture is going to have people who hate, but some of us hide behind religion to do it and make it seem respectable. Those are the ones making the problems.
As long as God is on our side.
Exactly. They don't, and the essence of fundamentalism is, I don't think I'm better than you. I just think God thinks I'm better than you. And when you believe that, you have made yourself okay with any kind of sin in the world, because I'm automatically forgiven because God's on my side no matter what. And it's this kind of spiritual smugness that I think is an atheist factory. And it loses sight of all the great things that people of faith do every day. And yeah, you can point out to all kinds of horrible things in history that religion has done. Sure, I'll be the first to admit it. But we have no way of measuring how many murders, rapes, and crimes weren't committed.
Of course.
Because people had a design for living. They had a fear of doing the wrong thing, and they wanted to be better people. And that's something that I don't get a lot of in the media. So I try to find creative and hopefully funny ways to talk about it without being preachy.
Tell us a little bit about your experience with the Beatles.
Well, sure.
You gave the last, George, you were the last one to speak with George on the media, huh?
The last televised interview, yeah. I had worked with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr and even Yoko Ono, and George Harrison came in with Ravi Shankar. He had produced a record of traditional Indian Vedic chants called Chants of India. And he came in to do a 10-minute soundbite, and I was the biggest George Harrison fan in the world. I was a Beatles nerd, and I was so thrilled to meet him, and I just wanted to talk about his spiritual journey. He was raised Catholic, and his spiritual path took him into more Indian faith and Krishna consciousness and chanting. And he, you know, didn't stay Catholic, but he certainly stayed very, very spiritual and talked about Christ extensively, talked about God nonstop, as well as talking about Krishna and Buddha. So we're having this interview, me and George Harrison, and I'm this 26-year-old kid meeting his rock and roll idol. Yes. I couldn't shut up. I was a terrible interviewer. And the whole time the producer's in my ear saying, ask him about John Lennon, ask about the Beatles. And he didn't want to talk about the Beatles. He wanted to talk about meditation. And so we talked about God, and we talked about what happens when you die. And that's all he cared about. He was one of the most famous men in the world by the time he was 21. And he said to me, I'm still trying to figure out who I am every day. I'm a gardener now. And I said, but didn't performing, didn't playing music and creating make you feel that spiritual connection? He said, not as much as gardening, not as much as meditation and prayer.
Wow.
And he wound up sticking around for 4 hours, and he played 4 songs on a guitar.
What, a 20-minute interview went for 4 hours. I love it.
Someone put a guitar in his hands. He hadn't done a concert in America since the 70s, and he played 4 songs. It was the last time he ever played in public. And they aired a little special that was like half an hour long. Nobody watched it, but when George got sick, I was up at the Montreal Comedy Festival, and VH1 called me and said, hey, we're recutting this. And I came down to help them, and they put back all the spiritual content back into the show. And at one point, George even said, this is a bit lofty for VH1, because you never hear people talking about religion with any dignity. Yes. Let me tell you, Father, when George died, the day he died, VH1 aired this 1-hour version of the special around the clock. And what it was George and some 26-year-old over-caffeinated kid talking about God and spirituality and what happens when you die. The day he died, it aired, and he kept saying, that's the only thing that matters to me, is being prepared for that moment and for the next step of your journey. And to this day, I will have like big heterosexual guys walk up to me in airports and hug me because of that interview, and they all say the same thing. It's the first time I ever saw anything on TV that took spirituality seriously on that kind of like MTV Networks kind of programming. And so I'll always, and a brief clip of it is in the new Martin Scorsese, George Harrison documentary that just aired on HBO. And I'll always be grateful because he helped my spiritual growth a lot. And
well, as an entertainer.
Yeah.
To share that,
And it taught me that, there is such a hunger out there, even among secular people who want to believe or who have a spiritual yearning. And, maybe people have lost faith with the religion they were raised in. It happens all the time. But they don't lose faith in God. They don't lose faith in something better. They don't lose faith in the fact that there's something inside me that can make the world better and make me better in doing so. And so I commend you for the kind of good work you're doing here and for talking about spirituality with a lot of intelligence and dignity.
We're going to take a break, and I want to come back, and I want to ask you a question that we kind of jumped off with about God having a sense of humor.
I'd love to.
Stay tuned. We're going to be right back. John, your whole life is filled with humor, and yet sometimes we relegate God to the angry God that's bringing out devastation on the world and wanting to make a whole bunch of laws to make us very uncomfortable.
The angry, drunken step God.
Right. Tell us, do you think God has a sense of humor?
I think God has a sense of joy.
Ooh, okay.
And I think that if God wanted us to be miserable, we'd have been born Mets fans.
Or Cleveland Brown football fans.
Or Clippers fans. Yeah, it could be a lot worse, And it's really easy, even for people of faith, to slide into despair. And Cervantes said, there is no greater folly than for man to despair. And for everything you look at in the world that's horrible right now, I can show you 10 things where we're getting better, where we're getting kinder, where we're getting more loving to each other.
Why not?
And where we're improving as a species. It's one thing to honor thy father and mother, but I think we're also called upon to improve upon our father and mother and be better with each passing generation. So I think that, under the umbrella of God has a sense of joy, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure Jesus did. If Jesus was against drinking, Jesus was the leading cause of drinking at parties, if you read the Bible. So, I think Jesus knew how to have a good time, and
well, Jesus
other
also,
people have a good time too.
When you find, like, getting out of the, walking on the water, and then seeing Peter and saying, you want to try this, and then Peter getting, walking on the water, and then boom,
he got punked.
He's got to pull him up again, But I'm sure that there's all kind, and what humor really is based on surprises, thing you didn't expect. And boy, Jesus came at a lot of unexpected things that I'm sure that if you were able to really understand his love, you'd have to smile.
Well, I have this really radical left-wing theory, Father, that God's in charge.
And where did you get that idea? Now, come on, straighten out now.
If you're in a place of despondency, if you've lost faith, if you're sad, if you're lonely, if you're losing faith, you got to ask yourself, where's my faith? Is God in charge or not? Are things happening the way they are? And I'm a political comic, so I've always got my liberal friends and my conservative friends coming up to me saying how bad things are and the country's going to hell and everything's terrible. And I'm like, hang on, all empires of man must collapse, and America's definitely going through some tough times. Sure. And maybe we're meant to go back to just being a republic and not being an empire anymore. And maybe we have to suffer for a while to make America stronger. But there's so much out there that is wonderful, that is changing, and really, what is the goodness you're going to bring into this world? Amen. So really, I think I don't worry about the devil. I worry about the darkness and the despair and fear and depression in our own hearts. And I think I don't think God necessarily wants you to be down. I think you get to be here for a limited time. We may as well enjoy the ride.
I need you to please, would you let me know what you think? Do you really think God has a sense of humor? You can go onto the webpage, you can do our Facebook, you can do our Twitter. I want to hear from you. John has given you his insight into that situation, and now we do that. But John, would you pray with me over these people? We get all kind of phone calls, we get all kind of letters, emails of people that are asking if we'd pray and if God would come into their life with healing into marriages, healing into sicknesses, healing into some of the emotional problems that they're going through. Lord, I ask you, please, with your great, great power, the power that John just spoke of, change lives, bring about your peace, bring about your healing, bring about your love. But most of all, Lord, would you bring about your hope into lives that are very, very sad. We pray that all in Jesus' name. And may Jesus' love for you always make you smile.